hello to our viewers around the world, wherever you're logging in from. I'm Molly Rosenberg. I'm director of the RSL, where we platform literary events that showcase some of the finest new writing out now or offer a new lens on a powerful older text. This event does both. Fantastic and helpful, as we mark the centenary of Franz Kafka's death in 1924. Much like our audience, contributors to this book live in cities from Prague to London and New York and have roots from China to Ireland and Jamaica. The stories in this book are, unsurprisingly, wonderfully eclectic and wide-ranging. Here tonight to talk to two of the contributors is Hephzibah Anderson, who has written for publications including The Times, The Economist, and Vogue, and has been a columnist for both Prospect and The Critic. These days, she's most often found in the pages of The Observer and also edits the Mail on Sunday's fiction coverage. Just before I pass to Hephzibah, make sure to keep your questions coming in via the Q&A function and the chat function on Zoom, and you'll be able to have those answered at the end. Great. Well, I'll leave it now to Hephzibah to introduce tonight's writers, and I hope to see you all at an RSL event soon. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you so much for that, Molly. And what a treat it is to be here with you all on a very cold evening in England. You might be wondering why Molly only mentioned two authors. Unfortunately, Naomi Alderman cannot be with us this evening. This has been an event that has been slightly dogged by technical issues, flight delays, ill health, you name it. But I am thrilled to be able to introduce you to two of the contributors to this exceedingly good collection of stories, and they are Leone Ross and Tommy Orange. Leone Ross was born in Britain, but moved to Jamaica as a child, returning for a master's degree in London, where she still lives. As a fiction writer, she's written speculative fiction, erotica, and magic realism, and she's also a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. Her contribution to this anthology is Headache, a story whose protagonist's orgasm-triggered headaches lead her into a baffling, nightmarish maze of medical interventions. Tommy Orange was born in California and raised in an evangelical church, but on his father's side, he's Cheyenne, an identity and heritage that powers his fiction, including his most recent novel, Wandering Stars, which was shortlisted for this year's Booker Prize. His Kafkaesque tale, The Hurt, imagines a world ravaged by a virus that, for a few life-changing minutes, inflicts inarticulable but oddly transcendent pain on its sufferers. We are lucky enough to have both of them read for us this evening, and I'm going to begin with that, but I also wanted to ask them a little question each in advance. Leone, we're going to start with you, and I wondered, just before you began reading, could you tell us a little bit about how you first encountered Kafka as a reader?
I think I encountered a good evening to everybody. I think I encountered Kafka through my father, who seemed to have periods of being very fond of him and then not liking him at all. And I started writing very young, but I was always a little worried about being good enough. And I think that feeling has, followed me a little bit over the years. And my father would occasionally read me bits and pieces of the conversations that Kafka would have with his editor, as to try to, just in a very simple, child appropriate way to say that this is a complicated thing to be an artist, and just because you're a little bit nervous doesn't mean that there's a problem. And so that's how I came to Kafka, as through my father. And then maybe age 20, which feels a little late, I kind of thought, what is this man? Do I like him? Will I like him? I think I was a bit nervous not to like him, because my father felt many things about Kafka's work, and I ended up liking him a lot. That's how I get.
Wonderful. Would you care to read for us? We'd
Yes,
be thrilled to hear. Thank you.
Okay, as I said, I'm going to read from Headache. The letter about the orgasmic headaches arrives through her door at 10:37 p.m. and Kinshasa Cabral is momentarily puzzled. Then she opens it, remembers, sucks her teeth and shows it to her boyfriend, Noah Golden. He's fresh out of the shower, sitting on the side of her bed, cocoa buttering. But that was a year ago, he says, turning the flaccid letter over in his hands. Yes, says Kinshasa Cabral. She remembers the onset. Noah Golden was nestled between her thighs, doing something helpfully repetitive with his tongue, when a terrible heat rippled up her back and into the nape of her neck. On climax, she felt as if her forehead was melting and clutched her skull, unable to speak for several agonized minutes, barely registering Noah's hands cradling her. When the awful headache happened 5 times in succession, Kinshasa described the symptoms minutely to a grey-eyed doctor who was visibly uncomfortable at her candour. Barely 30, Kinshasa has never been sick enough to develop a relationship with a doctor, but she enjoys precision. She likes that Noah Golden nurtures ghost peppers and white roses on his apartment balcony. She likes transferring grades from emails to spreadsheets for examination boards at the university where she has worked for a decade. She likes crossword puzzles and mystery novels. She loves watching her best friend, Monica, knit soft, peachy shawls. She should have known something would go astray with this doctor, squinting at her notes, remarking that Kinshasa's symptoms were unusual. What gan badaman in can't go good evening, Kinshasa's mother likes to say, and she's quite right. The shirking doctor said she would refer Kinshasa Cabral for a brain scan, but no letter had arrived, and the headaches went away as quickly as they came. As the weeks passed, they'd return to their usual lovemaking, all chuckling kisses and Noah's pubic bone in just the right place, although at first he found it difficult to orgasm himself because he was worried about hurting her. Bright and early, Kinshasa calls the doctor to say she doesn't need the scan anymore. The receptionist says he would know about that. Can I speak to someone who does know, says Kinshasa Cabral politely, but the receptionist says call the hospital where the scan is scheduled. She calls the hospital 3 times from work, waiting 47 minutes, 31 minutes, then nearly an hour on different days. Monica, her friend, says she should just go because there's 7.7 million people on waiting lists and the delay on the scan doesn't make it unnecessary. Kinshasa says the lack of headaches makes it unnecessary. She understands bureaucracy. If she can just find the right administrator, she'll get a box unticked or a screen changed in no time, but she has no success. 9 days later, she finds herself in a congested waiting room, wedged between a sleeping drunk and a chatty woman with 3 small, freckled, galloping children. The mother is in a scarlet frock and broken fishnet tights and looks surprisingly well rested. Kinshasa feels distracted and tired. The children bounce off the slick walls like ping-pong balls. They're Maisie, Kirkland and Anastasia, says the mother, as if anyone's interested. Kinshasa Cabral nods politely. There is a clock that ticks and orange posters on the walls about IUDs. The red-frocked mother asks if she's here for something bad, and Kinshasa says no. It isn't syphilis or something, is it? Says the woman, hunching forward, and Kinshasa says she'd rather she didn't guess, thank you. Oh God, says the mother, it's something really bad, isn't it? I'm so sorry. She doesn't look sorry, she looks inquisitive. It's just a mistake, says Kinshasa. It's an MRI I don't need anymore. They never make that kind of mistake, says the mother. The drunk laughs, like a man not quite right. For the first time, Kinshasa is more worried than annoyed.
She has very good reason to be worried, as it turns out. Oh, that's one. Yes. I mean, it's already deeply Kafkaesque, and I do want to go back and unpack a bit what we mean by Kafkaesque, but it's very Kafkaesque, but also very, very Leone Ross.
Oh, thank you.
Yes, and I think that's probably a really interesting juggling act to have performed. But I'm going to bring Tommy in, and then, Tommy, are you there? He was here.
He's coming.
He's coming. Tommy, hello. And
Hello.
you are in California this evening. You are not here shivering in England.
I'm in Oakland, yes. It's starting to get cold, but probably nothing like there.
Can I begin by asking you the same question I put to Leone? How did you first encounter Kafka as a reader?
Yeah, so I came to him kind of in a weird way. I started reading late and writing late relatively. I was in my 20s, early 20s, and I got a job at a used bookstore. And as a reader, I wasn't even reading fiction at the time. I was reading obscure religious texts like the Upanishads and psychology books and philosophy, and sort of stumbled into weird fiction like Borges and then Kafka. And they were like kind of a bridge from that stuff that I was going to for meaning to the world, the whole world of fiction and all that I didn't know it was. And the book that really got me, and it was before I read more of his like straight fiction, which none of it's straight, whatever straight means. Um, it was the Blue Octavo notebooks, his fragments that he actually wrote in these notebooks that were collected into a pretty thin volume, I believe by Max Brod. And they just, he was doing so much with these fragments, and it's really hard to pin down exactly what he's doing, but it's like sometimes it's just imagery, sometimes it's this evokes these feelings, and always just filled with mysterious meaning. So there's nobody that does what he does, and it got me right away.
Mystery. I think that's your cue to read from your story.
Okay. His father had written and performed a popular song, a one-hit wonder. It was a love song. He'd sold the rights to the song to a fast food company for millions. The commercial had done very well for the company. You'd know the song right away if you heard it, and would associate it immediately with the fast food. It always disturbed Kay that love songs could so easily become about hamburgers. With the money, Kay's father had then invested in a water bottle startup that introduced caffeinated water, which had done so well his father had retired on a yacht somewhere with bad cell reception, so that any time Kay talked with his father on the phone, it was broken up to the point of being ununderstandable. So ununderstandable, Kay had stopped picking up the phone when he called, and so his father called less and less. He doesn't even know Daryl is dead. Knowing he belongs to the very rich makes Kay want to suffer. Somewhere beneath his inability to feel joy drags the anchor of that other thing he doesn't know he is asking for, to suffer, to not have it be too easy. What is this secret wish or want, and why does he keep throwing himself at it despite generally disliking all forms of discomfort? Is it more noble to suffer than to breeze through life, maybe? But is it vanity to voice your suffering, to express your pain as if it makes you special? A man is walking his Labradoodle, and Kay watches the man and his dog almost get run over by one of these mini EV cars that can fit only 2 people. It doesn't faze the dog at all, but brings the man's cheeks to a pink. He watches the little car drive off with indignation, but is then pulled toward Kay by the dog. As the dog nears, he whimpers, and Kay is happy with this result, as he doesn't want to have to talk to the man. The man gives him a concerned look. Kay smiles a smile at him he knows must be a grimace. This concerns the man even more. Kay is relieved when they move away from him. Kay is a slight man with a slight frame and a mild demeanor, but his face gives off a kind of aggression he doesn't know scared people and dogs, apparently. Kay is thinking he will not succumb to worry, even while beginning to succumb to worry, as he sees how many people are here in the park gathering socially like nothing is wrong. When Kay first hears the screaming, there is no mistaking what is happening for anything else. The man with his Labradoodle is the first to notice, and he runs over to where it's coming from, but is quickly stopped by the sound of a voice coming from a drone flying overhead. The voice is telling everyone to remain calm. Kay stands and walks toward the screams without even thinking whether to do so or not. He is staring with his mouth slightly hung open and is feeling like he is seeing someone famous. After seeing all the videos of people going through it, here it is, the real thing in real life, and the sound is truly something else. It's horrible, but somehow also glorious to Kay, and before he knows he's doing it, he has his phone out, pointing it at the screaming man not 50 feet away, recording the event like something strange in the sky, like he never has felt the desire to do. He wants to keep this thing for later, this awful sound. The video recording of a young man holding his stomach and looking like he's absolutely going to puke his own heart out if he can. I'll stop there.
Such good stories, the both of them. And already intriguing overlaps between the approach you've both taken. You both have protagonists whose names are K names or just an initial. And I also loved that you both, these are profoundly strange narratives, but they're bedded down in a really sort of meticulous, understated realism. Both, I think, traits that we think of when we think of Kafka's own writing. And I guess I wanted to ask you both initially where the idea for each of your story originated, and once you had the idea, once you had the germ of the story, how did you then go about making clear that it was an homage to Kafka without veering too close to pastiche or losing your own voice? And I wondered if you could each talk about some of the challenges involved in that. Maybe talk about where the idea came from initially. That makes sense. Who would like to go first?
I'm happy to say,
Okay,
because I remember it was a very, very specific moment.
Yeah.
I was watching my son's soccer game, and there's a thing that I don't know how common this is. If somebody gets hurt on the field, both teams take a knee, and sort of wait to make sure they're okay. And in that moment, while I'm watching my son's soccer game, I just thought of, and this was post-pandemic, I thought of the idea of if somebody was suffering in life, for people in society to like kneel to honor sort of their suffering. And then it sort of morphed into like, well, what if there was some kind of virus, and if people saw it in public, they would sort of kneel to be with them and sort of witness them, or, be in solidarity or something. And then I thought about Colin Kaepernick and taking a knee, and I knew there was some material there to work with. So I had that story floating in my head for a while. And then when they asked me to do a Kafka story, I was like, oh, this could work for that. And then I started sort of trying to make it, because I hadn't written, it was all written in my head. And so I hadn't written anything. So I didn't have to adapt the story to make it Kafka. I just had to think of how to do it as an homage.
So interesting that it was all written in your head. So enviable. And also that it was an idea. Because writing to a brief, I don't know how usual that is for either of you. It seems unusual, perhaps not in other artistic forms, but in literary terms, to be given. I mean, was it how open was the brief? Was it just, Kafka?
I mean, it felt pretty open. It was kind of like Kafka and what that brings up for you. Admittedly, our lovely editor did have a couple of suggestions, given that she knew my obsessions and my politics and stuff. So she had a couple of things. She's like, would you like to look at this, that, the other? In the end, her suggestions were wonderful, but didn't resonate with me. I didn't luckily have a story that might be suitable to this in my head. So I had to, but in that way that you do, I think that matter of kind of being commissioned or briefed for a thing, I don't respond very well to that, no. Because things come to me as they come organically, and then I respond creatively. So, I mean, I always want to feel good about it and easy about it, but I don't find it necessarily very easy. So, but what I then do is I go, okay, so here is the brief, or here's the commission. Let me just let that simmer, and something will come. And I tried a couple of things on for size. And I think what was coming to me almost immediately was that sense of kind of frustration is so clear in Kafka's longer works in particular, whether it is frustration with bureaucracy or frustration when there are problems with communication, or frustrations with the self. And that has always, I've always kind of yelled at Kafka on the page a little bit, like, oh, for God's sake, someone do something, work out the bug, or help the trial, or, something. And bureaucracy drives me mad in particular. And I was having a period of having headaches. And it's just that lovely thing that, of course, happens. You say, well, what if? And I thought, ooh, orgasmic headaches. That could be interesting. And then I found it's a real thing. It's actually a real thing. It's not very common, but does happen to some people, that they have terrible headaches that build like an orgasm and kind of explode on climax. And that started moving me into thinking about where that could go to. So not, of course, not just as a kind of giggle, but something more thoughtful. And that became Kinshasa's situation, which is, I don't want to give anything away, but that because people read the story, but that she gets put into a frustrating situation, and very explicitly, very quickly, I wanted to racialize that. I wanted this to be about this particular Black woman, because Black women in particular are treated differently in medical institutions, and that's been proven over and over again because of lots of mythologies about the way that our skin is and the way the way that we work. So that can happen a lot. And so I wanted to talk about, but not just that. I didn't necessarily want anything bad to happen to Kinshasa as a Black woman, even though it was happening as a result of being a Black woman. I wanted to actually build things that made her think, am I crazy? Am I crazy? Am I crazy? Am I crazy? And in the end, it absolutely has to do with her being both vulnerable and a Black woman.
So it's a really, really clever knitting together of your interests and themes as a writer. And were there any moments when you thought, oh no, this is too Kafkaesque? This is any moments where you would, when you edited it, did you take anything out? Did you feel there was a risk of, or was it quite organic, the extent to which the story was in conversation with Kafka's work?
Was it, I suppose it was organic for you, wasn't it, Tommy? If it kind of was there already, then it has the opportunity to be really organic.
I mean, I think sometimes the Kafkaesque thing is like people apply it to weird.
Yeah.
And just sort of generally. And I think so much of the time he's not being that weird. He certainly can be, but every writer can be. I think sometimes he's really tedious and frustrating. Like he can be frustrating to read, but also just frustrated, and you can feel this tension that's simmering below a surface of like a sort of mysteriously good prose. And I feel like I have never felt like, oh, I'm getting too close to him as a stylist or as a writer, because you can't, because he's so innately good at what he does as a writer, and he's so committed to being the kind of writer that he was, that I don't ever feel like anybody could really imitate him. And it's so wrapped up in like him having a day job and having this passion as a writer and not being able to ever get out of that, and being stuck in all kinds of internal traps in his mind and heart, and writing through all that. So I never felt like I was gonna like fall into his style or be getting too close to him. I always felt like if I could do my thing stylistically and be trying to nod in his direction.
I think I felt similarly, because I started out not only with a respect for what he does at a kind of granular level, but also we know more than average about the way Kafka felt, or said he felt, about writing and about being a writer and about taking care of himself and trusting in himself. And that's something, as I said earlier, I've always related to. So in a strange way, past the kind of feeling of frustration and the kind of politics that were coming up for me, I just thought, well, I find his anxiety comforting. As Tommy says, he's so good at what he does. There's no, sentence, I won't overstate, but, a Kafka sentence is a Kafka sentence, right? And I wonder whether he would ever have been able to hear that. And if he'd lived for hundreds of years, we could reassure him. And so that may seem like it's going off track, but actually I held that sense of kind of honoring his anxiety, because I myself were anxious all the way through the work. And so if anything, I imagined myself kind of offering it to him and going, do you get this? Because if you get it, doesn't matter stylistically whether you agree. Maybe you'd even get your red pen out, Kafka, but I know you'd get it. Yeah, you know, and it was that feeling. I think that's what I wanted to feel at the end, that I could give it to him and he would go, okay, yeah, I get that. And if he didn't, you know, I'd give him a little mini lesson on microaggressions and life in 2024 as a Black woman. But you know, I think you'd have been open to that too, funnily enough.
Yeah, he'd have answered you as a you know, a German speaking Jew, and
yes, I think we would have done our best to be Alex, I think. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting for me that this was such an interesting collection, because it was writers' relationships with a writer. So the themes that emerged, and there were themes and unexpected themes shared, you know, it allowed you to step back from everything that Kafka-esque as a term has become, and it really showed you new angles and what it really is about. And I just think writers, and maybe even fiction, is the best way to frame that conversation. Yeah, I mean, what does Kafka-esque mean to each of you, and did your sense of that change as at all? Has it changed over the years, or perhaps even as a result of this exercise, writing these particular stories? Again, I don't know. Should we?
Tommy, want to go?
Tell me, or if you've got something.
Sure.
I want you going back and forth. You go, Ben.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could do an anthology like this once a year, and you would probably get a lot of really cool stories that are in, you know, the Kafka wheelhouse, what he might have come up with in a way. I think if you're not writing an homage, I don't think anybody ever really is Kafka-esque. Like Haruki Murakami, for example, who has a new book out today. Often that word has been applied to his work, and I've never seen it. You know, it's just like, it's fantastic or it's weird. And so we're going to say Kafka-esque. And I just don't think that's what's going on in I don't think there's a comparison to be made. And no, you know, no disrespect to Murakami for it. It's just, I just feel like it's a term that's really been, weird things have been done with it. I think to me, it really has more to do with being trapped and being like sort of this claustrophobic, but also like sort of the trap has teeth, and it's sort of like the trap has a mind and it's keeping you in it, but you can't see the source of the mind, and you're sort of lost in this labyrinthine space of like trying to get out of it. And that could look like something very plain, or there could be like a premise, like a, you know, like the castle, or, you know, becoming a cockroach. It can take on a premise, but throughout his work, I feel like there's this maze, and there's this looming presence that is maybe just daddy issues. Just kidding. But you know, there's something in his work that I just don't feel like, it ever should have been turned into an adjective, because I really feel like he's singular. That being said, I do think the idea of continuing this anthology work, I think people purposefully trying to do something as an homage to him, I think could be really successful, and I think it showed in this book.
I think the thing about Kafkaesque is initially it felt heavy, so I decided to ignore it. As I can't, I think I maybe had a half day of thinking, do I even know what that is? And then kind of anxiously got to Googling. And maybe within 15 minutes, so it's a waste of bloody time. What you need to do is trust yourself and how you have felt. Because I think one doesn't have to then write like Kafka In fact, as Tommy is suggesting, such a thing is impossible anyway, so you just drive yourself nuts. But how does Kafka make you feel? What does Kafka bring up for you? And actually, I hadn't read very much of his short work before this, but in our lovely brief, and of course knowing that the title, it came to my attention. I thought, oh my God, I've left this out. I haven't read a lot of this. And I found him, Tommy, what I loved about it, because that's what you got first, right? The whimsy of it. He's actually, of course, he's dark and he's strange, but there's something lighter, oddly, I find, about the short work, which did give me a whole new perspective on how I could play. It gave me a little bit of permission. It feels to me that he was in a very different mood with these small snippets, the snippets particularly, rather than even a finished short work, you know. I could imagine him musing and playing and maybe giggling to himself, which isn't how I'd felt about Kafka before on the page. So I was very pleased to get that kind of permission as well, and be reminded how we bring different moods to the page often does depend on what form we're working in and what stage of life we're in, and the part of us that is allowed to behave a certain way on the page when we have a short story in front of us rather than a novel or whatever. So yes, that was interesting and made me feel differently about him. And it was interesting to read new Kafka in my 50s. That was a lovely gift that I think this process gave me.
It's so interesting to hear you talk about the image that you were conjuring up in your mind of him as a person, actually, because I was wondering whether to what extent he himself as a figure intruded on your reading, on your encounters with him as a text. And it sounds like, certainly for you, Leone, he was quite a lively, vital presence.
As I said, I just like that he was tremendously miserable about the whole thing. You know, I mean, I'm slightly playing, but you know, there was evidence of his concern, evidence of blocks, of course, ill health, you know, not believing himself, you know, that terrible intimacy, and I use both those words on purpose, of the editor and the writer, depending on how you get on, of course, layers of trust and blah blah. So I get all of that. He and Jean Toomer, who is a less known writer in the Harlem Renaissance, who wrote a collection of short stories and poetry called Cain in the 1930s. I think both Kafka and Jean Toomer have always comforted me that they're so clever and so good at what they do and so batshit crazy, excuse my language. So it makes me feel better, that's all.
And also I love that for both of you, your initial encounters with him are so intimately woven into your biographies as writers yourselves, and you each encountered him at a really vital moment in your creative development.
And I think even understanding his life as a writer, like, for instance, we only are having this conversation about him because his best friend betrayed him, because he actually wanted all of his work burned or gotten rid of, I don't remember how, which is like the most relatable writerly thing he could have gift to writers who doubt themselves to the end, even more than the writers who kill themselves and probably want their work to live on after them. He didn't do that. He wanted to suicide his work and have it completely disappear. And I think that always struck me as a writer and continues to live with me as like, well, Kafka didn't believe in his work even after it was all done. And that's incredible to be able to, as a writer, live with your own doubt and just know that, you know, one of the greatest had that to the end. And so just accept it and use it as part of your tool for revision. Yeah. I almost feel as a teacher and an editor, I want to give him a hug and also shake him a bit and go, really, it really is fine. And I really get it. And it really is fine. Go to a workshop, quickly, go to a workshop, you know, talk to other writers about it. I mean, and I think also when you were speaking, Tommy, it just reminded me in the same way that my best friend told me many years ago, I was complaining about the end of some novel or something and that I hated it. I hated it and I was going to just throw it away. And she went, oh, good, you'll be finished then. I said, what do you mean? She said, always at this point, you tell me how it's rubbish. No one will ever like it. You are complete. Why are you trying to do this? At that point, I know that the thing is done. And she's right. But now that I know that of myself, when that comes up, I go,
there you are, insecurity. Okay, hi, how you doing? You're part of the process, and I go to the next stage.
Leone, do you teach him at all, Kafka?
Yes, I do teach bits of him. I teach bits of him for characterization and creeping dread.
How do the kids respond to him these days?
Just fine. I mean, I teach at all kinds of different levels. I think they think he's a bit long, but they do again respond to the bureaucracy and the foolishness. As one she said, this is foolishness. Well, why don't they just speak to each other? Why don't they just, that kind of frustration comes up again and again in the classroom. I think this sense of, why can't we change this process? What is wrong with the systems? And again, that what you were saying, Tommy, that sense of almost being watched over the shoulder. There's always this sense of otherness somewhere over here, some large dark thing messing with things, and that I think young people respond to and they really recognize it. But it can take some time to get them into it. But once you're there, it's good.
Yeah, I mean, it feels that even in the rescheduling of this event, I think we were first meant to do it a couple of months ago, and it feels like the world has become yet more Kafka-like rather than Kafkaesque in the interim. And I wonder whether you feel that we're living in a world ever more like something Kafka could have envisaged, and what do you think? What insights do you as fellow writers have into his ability to channel those feelings that that we have today, 100 years after his death, about the world around us?
Yeah.
Speaking from America, Tommy.
In America, and I didn't mean to shut down the use of Kafkaesque. I think we can totally still use it, and everybody knows what we're talking about. It's become its own thing. I think it's in America. It's almost more Orwellian, sort of 1984. Like we have no memory for what's just happened. Let's just do it again, like clean slate after 6 months. And war means peace. Like, just it's nuts. And the totalitarian piece. I don't feel like Kafka ever was writing about totalitarian systems. It was much more internal and interior, and that's always why I loved him. And what drew me to writing in the first place was a sense of interiority. There's a lot of teaching about writing that really strong emphasis on scene. Where's the scene? Where's the scene? And what always drew me to fiction, and I do understand where that advice comes from, but what drew me to fiction in the first place was interiority, and that is what drew me to Kafka. But I do feel like the modern age, so not so much what's happening in America and the nightmare that it is, the modern age and the internet and sort of this feedback loop of the internet and social media and AI encroaching, that stuff all feels like it belongs somewhere in the Kafka universe, extended universe, for sure.
Yeah, agreed. Just as you were speaking, Tommy, I was thinking if Kafka was here, he would be writing about someone in front of the screen, not the internet itself, So he would go, he would have been interior in that way, it would have been the light flickering on that person, not talking about the particularities of the system in front, Yeah, I think that Kafka in many ways is, for me, a witness as a writer. And I've been thinking about that a lot in the context of, global change, but also global things that have always been, things like what is happening in Sudan, in Palestine, the complexities of these things because it's over and over and over and over again. And I think Kafka never left the individual behind. I think you're so absolutely right, Tommy. It's almost like he wanted to sit in that skin, which is the effect of the history or the effect of the systems or the effect of the structures, and limits in a way. It keeps his eyes sharp. It keeps his focus clean. So it would have been interesting to see how that interiority would be contextualized in 2024. He would have had a lot, but then of course he would. Yeah, I think that at this time in life, always it has been so, but I feel particularly conscious of it at this time. Well, I'm thinking, well, what can I write, and what is writing, and what is this for? And really, I'm going to write when I want to rip the world apart in some ways. I want to, turn everything off and start again. I think it is that witnessing. Of course, not just Kafka does, of course not, but that sense of, let us say something true about a person in this context, in this time.
And on that note, one of his quotes that always continues to bring me back to writing, he said a book should be an axe that cracks the frozen sea inside, or something like that. But that the urgency and the purpose of writing was that so clear to him. He's not writing fantasy, fan fiction, or whatever, just like to pass the time or to have somebody else escape into his fiction for fun. Is very much to crack the frozen sea inside. And that kind of urgency is something we need right now and like you said, at all times the world is ending, and it's not, and the next thing will replace the one before. And but I feel that urgency never leaves me, and the search for that urgency when I'm writing, to try to write with the urgency and with the stakes that have to do with what the world that we live in now.
I think we need to keep on cracking ourselves, I think you're right, because the temptation, oddly, the temptation when one is safe and warm and doesn't have bombs dropping on you, or is to kind of freeze in response to these many overwhelming global things. What can we do? Well, I don't know what I can do as one person feeling, but that feels like its own potential indulgence, It was ever thus, and so how will we crack ourselves open and keep on going? I do think there's a time to rest, and then there's a time to go, okay, let's keep going. What can be done? How can we respond? I certainly know my ancestors had a harder time than I. So I also think of them and think, well, if they could get through slavery, and many of them didn't, maybe I can get through Trump for 4 years as he burns the world down, for example.
The title I loved of the collection, and Becca Rothfeld's introduction is really riveting stuff. In terms of Kafka's own relationship to those words, a cage in search. Yes, exactly. A cage.
Oh, no, it doesn't come out properly, does it? Yes, a cage went in search of. Yeah.
I wonder if in your own creative practice, either of you has a cage that you are desperate to break free of and feel destined to be trapped in.
I mean, I think, this doubt and self-hatred thing, is, even with the insight that it's part of the tool necessary, the fact of continuing to return to it and wanting to give up and thinking that everything you've ever done is garbage, and that Kafka could think that at the end of his life. Like I could see getting to that place, because it can sneak up on you, the self-doubt and the sort of bottoming out that can happen as you try to do the creative work. I think you're inviting destruction, because they're two sides of the same coin. And so when you bring that in and start to work with that material, there's always the possibility that you destroy yourself in some way or destroy the work. And so I think that is always, to me, a precarious thing that I am continually thinking that I'm over, and then all of a sudden I'm right back in it.
Mm-hmm. I think as both of you were speaking in terms of cages, I was going to go solemn, but actually it occurs to me that one enters a particular kind of set of limits when you're creating particularly a short story. Very quickly you have to decide how to close the door on a million other ideas. how to limit your time frame, how to make sure that your focus is on only so many scenes and no more for the work and so on, all of those technical requirements that need to happen. My favorite cage is sitting down, messing around with a metaphor. Is my favorite moment of having to surround myself with limits. And I love this metaphor. It's just endless in its possibilities. You know, a cage went in search of a bird. I like the cage of the decisions around metaphors, and I suppose that's what brings that to mind. You know, ideas of, you know, of course, you're stuck in a garret as a dying poet, and all of these things, they're all about restriction. They're all about sitting down and focusing, but something beautiful can be created in that limit as well. In fact, you have to limit yourself in order to write, because you can't write everything that comes into your head all at the same time. And so at some point you make a decision of one metaphor over the other, one ending for a story over the other, and so on. So I quite like this image as a way to think about creative process in that kind of way.
We have some audience questions here, actually. If I could read out the first to you both. What do you think Kafka would have made of your stories? Leone, you slightly touched on it. You expect maybe some red pen. Small amount.
I would have wondered what he thought of my constant sexual references. That would have been an interesting conversation, considering that he himself had very intense feelings about, you know, the women in his life. Perhaps we would have had a conversation about that. It would have amused me to think of him being embarrassed at anything that I wrote, particularly as a woman. And, you know, come on, let's be real. He would have had his own conservatism. Yeah. So that would have been an interesting conversation.
Tell me any.
Yeah, it's a bit hard for me to imagine. It's hard for me to.
Oh, really?
You know, I thinking like in some kind of realistic way, is he brought back to life? Are we time traveling with my piece back to him? Like, or is he reading it into his context, or does he understand the context that I wrote it in? All these things that I have to think about as a realist, because I can't just have him like somehow openly knowing all things and reading it, because then that's not even him.
See, I think if Naomi had been here, she could have fashioned some portal in which you all would
to allow for that. Whereas as a magical realist, I'm just like, he's here on the token. We don't have to get into it. We don't have to question it. He is here.
Sorry, I interrupted you, Tommy. I think you haven't.
Oh, I don't really have an answer, because that's where my mind goes, and I don't feel like I can imagine. You know, I don't honestly know what his reading habits were like, so I also don't have the context for like what was he into, and
I don't know that either.
Yeah, I don't feel like the stuff that I've read of his journals that he references reading that much. I'm sure he was a massive reader, but I just haven't read stuff about what his reading habits were. So that makes it harder for me to imagine what he would think of my writing.
Imagine him telling us that we thought it was rubbish.
Yeah.
Give up don't do it anymore.
And
I
thought I was bad.
Oh
no! Someone else asked that you've both spoken a little bit about thinking how it is to think about Kafka right now in today's world, as in, you know, November 2024, and they wonder whether, had you been commissioned right now rather than when you were commissioned, which I guess, I mean, Tommy, you said this was post-COVID yours, so I guess maybe a couple of years ago these commissions.
When was this? A year ago, maybe? Yeah. Not that long.
Okay. Oh, the question is, would you have written something different now? It's a hard one to answer.
That's a good question.
You mean if that was commissioned like more recently?
If they came, you know, if the email landed in your inbox this morning, would you be thinking about something different?
Yeah, completely. Yeah. You know, I always have story ideas that I keep in my notes, and so I would probably try to pick something. And then, you know, I'm always trying to like do two things at once, so I'd try to have it be like a chapter in a novel that I'm working on, so I'm doing double work. So I can only answer yes. I can't say like I would definitely do this idea because I don't like talking about ideas that are so young and undeveloped. But I definitely would have written something different because I use writing as a way to process the world, and the world feels very different after this last election decision. And I'm sure it'll inform the way that I write and the way that I process what the world is and what this country is.
Leone?
I do think it would be different again. I think in the past year, I've been very concerned with children dying unnecessarily. I'm writing a completely different novel, and yet it's pregnant with my distress about in that particular injustice. Yeah, I feel it in my body, you know. So whereas I couldn't tell you what I would write with this commission, it would have to be affected by this. It enrages and distresses me no end, and yet there has to be a language for it. And so I would be trying to do something around that.
Somebody else asked whether you sense that writing these stories and doing this exercise, communing with Kafka, has changed you as a writer or changed your artistic practice.
No.
I mean, I think if somebody had given me like a Kafka scholarship and I moved to Prague for a year and I had to write like Kafka for like an entire collection, then it would totally change me. But like just the story is not quite enough.
No.
They also ask actually whether you've learned anything about yourself through the journey. And I guess I would add to that, have you learned anything about Kafka through the act of writing these particular stories?
Well, I mean, as I said, you know, it was a nod towards the shorter work, the much
yeah.
the Flash. So there's that for me, I suppose. No, I think at the risk of sounding cheeky, and I don't mean anything to, I think it's a great question, questioner, whoever you are. But I think for me, I think you're overestimating the profundity of a single short story in a writer's life. You know, you write it, you have a relationship with the editor, you have a think, you put it down for a while, you pick it up again. It's done what you hope you said you would do, and then you move on to something else. And I think the whole thing becomes a kind of cumulative effect rather than necessarily one short story. But you may feel very differently, Tommy. I don't know.
No, I mean, something, maybe I didn't learn anything about Kafka, but something that I'm continually working with in my work is writing about identity and writing through the lens of being a Native person, Native American person. Sometimes, you know, the idea is embedded within the life of a Native person. Often my bigger novel ideas are that, and that's, you know, where my brain and heart lives because that's who I am and that's my whole history. And you know, but it's also being mixed race because my mom's white, my dad's Native. So it's the complexity of identity and writing about identity. And so when I wrote this story, the initial sort of bones of the story didn't have that piece in it. And sort of got this question since There came out in 2018 in various different forms. Like, are you ever going to write just a regular story? And it's like a really offensive question because it, you know, uses the white gaze as the default. And it's like, just want a regular story. And it's like,
I've got
what
that
is,
question too.
what is, yeah, it's annoying. It's annoying, but when I wrote the bones of the story, I'm like, okay, is this character am I gonna mention their race or not? And if I don't, is that using the default? And does the reader then become complicit in this idea that the default is white? And so I always return to that, and I'm like, well, I don't go around in the world thinking that the default is white, and so why would that not be a part of their story? So I worked in this piece about the character having this mom who may or may not have been Native. The dad was like sort of awful. And at the end, you still don't really know if the mom was, and she sort of makes fun of the idea. And I won't give away what happens at the end, not that it's some kind of twist, but anyway, it's something I had to reapproach as like, will I include it? Why wouldn't I include it? How do I include it? And always wanting to make it organic and not like, well, I'm doing this because I want to make it 2024 or I want to have it interface with my identity politics. It's not that. It's I'm writing from the lens of me, and that's always going to be included.
Yeah. I think we've got time for one last question. Where should a newbie start with Kafka? Someone who has not read Kafka at all. I mean, Leone, it sounds like you think maybe they should start with the shorter pieces.
No, you see, I mean, no, I think they should start with the longer pieces. In a strange way, the longer pieces are friendlier, to my mind, to a beginner reader anyway. I'm afraid I'd start with Metamorphosis, which seems like the cop-out, right? But it's just it's still such a good example of all his power and what he does and his intentions, and is weird, yet so much more than weird. In fact, that's the least interesting about it in the end, I find. That's where I'd start. I don't know about you, Tommy.
I think that, and it's also relatively short, and I think writing wise, I think it's his most accessible, because you're moving through scenes, and he's talking to his sister, and you don't always get such clarity, and so I think it'll if it gives you a taste for what he can do, then you'll be willing to do some of the deeper cuts. I think another example that came to mind just immediately, I believe it's called The Burrow, and it's a short story. I may be wrong about that.
No, you're
I
right.
think that's kind of a good entry point also.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, because it's accessible again, but it gives you enough of the sound of his voice on the page to decide whether you want to commune with that. Yeah.
And it's a little bit whimsical, which isn't always true of the other work, so I like that about it too.
Yeah.
I know I said that was the last question, but actually another one has just come in that I do think would be lovely to end on. Thank you. And say note that Kafka was largely unpublished and pretty much unknown in his lifetime. Could you think of an underrated author that we all should be reading right now and we should discover this evening?
That's a good question.
I mean, you did mention.
Well, I mentioned Jean
someone
Toomer,
who is, yes, exactly.
But Jean Toomer doesn't need to be bigged up. No, someone else urgently needs
I know, this is your moment, yeah.
Tommy, does someone come to your mind while I'm desperately?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't really have a gauge. I don't have a gauge for how popular he is. It's a Chilean writer named either Benjamin or Benjamin Labatut. He wrote When We Cease to Understand the World, and then The Maniac. They're very critically acclaimed, but I don't think he's widely known, and I think he should be. And I think he's doing something very singular with this. He's doing a blend of his history and philosophy and fiction, nonfiction. He may hate that I even would say that, because it's very much their novels, and they're doing what novels can do, which is whatever they want. But I think more people should read him. I think he's really amazing.
More people should read a writer called Louise Tondor, whose most recent work is a collection of short stories. It was published by a very small independent press. She has an astonishing capacity for specificity, for kind of quiet power. She wrote 2 novels that were very, very good in the 90s, but her most recent collection is about 3 years old, but is and my perimenopausal brain cannot remember the name, which is Lou's just going to laugh at me when that becomes evident. But Louise Tondor, Tondeur. I want Louise to be read much more. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that, both of you. I'm going to hand back to Molly, but just briefly saying, somebody also had asked if any tips on writing short stories, which they find particularly hard, and I would just urge you all to read this collection, and it's a model of how to construct short stories, quite apart from anything else. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Hephzibah, Tommy and Leone.